Our next two speakers are going to get us back into the 98% of the research that's being done. That is not social, but it's being done by people. So it's got that going for it. Okay, all right. And you guys have 15 minutes less than I'd originally given you because Stanley likes to be human as well. Just kidding. You're good. You're good. They're panicking. So we're going to shift gears again and get back into the more of the nuts and bolts, some of the science sorts of things, but it is humanly interpreted science. I've asked two folks, Matt Powers, who's an assistant professor here at OSU in Forest Ecosystems and Society, and Stephanie Wessel, who's a resource area silviculturist on the Salem BLM, to give us some ideas about what's possible from a management standpoint in some of these older stands. And Matt really made me happy the other day when he said, Cheryl, one of the tools in the silviculturist box is to do nothing. Silviculture can be a passive exercise where time just does what your interest is, and you don't necessarily have to go out and take an action. And I thought that was a really nice tribute to where the field of silviculture is going these days in terms of representing what the needs are out on the landscapes. So help me welcome Matt and Stephanie. They're going to tag team.
All right, so Stephanie and I got the great task of trying to assimilate and tie together some of these things that people have been talking about up to this point in the workshop in the context of sort of stand level management. And I kind of decided that as the academic of the two of us, I would just talk about broad concepts in sort of a naive and optimistic way, and then let Stephanie apply all of sort of the constraints of actually managing in federal land ownership. So that's kind of how our talk is going to run. And we start with this idea to kind of beat on a dead horse that, you know, mature forest stands over 80 are structurally variable, right? We can have stands that look like this one, which have kind of limited structural complexity, limited understory development, a limited range of tree sizes, dense primarily. The primary driver of sort of development in this stand is probably self-thinning. We can have a stand like this one that's being impacted by a chronic disturbance, in this case Phalinus root rot, which is generating dead wood, creating resources to stimulate understory development, contributing to sort of the initiation of multi-layered canopy and structural development, so maybe a little farther along on that OGSI. We can have stands that look like this that have a sort of distinct two-cohort structure with an overstory of, in this case, large Doug fir and an understory of very dense western hemlock with kind of very little on the forest floor. And you know, as another example, we can have stands that look like this, maybe representative of a stand that's been commercially thinned a few times, where we have a degree of understory development and a degree of kind of structural complexity starting to develop, but certainly limited deadwood and missing some of those other key characteristics of late cereal and old growth structure that we might be trying to manage for. Okay, so as silviculturists, we deal with this issue of how do we take our management objectives and apply them in the context of the current condition of the stand and kind of the history of the stand. And that's kind of where I'll lead off the talk. And before I get too far in, I want to deal very, very quickly with the idea of how management impacts stand productivity, because you'll sometimes hear the argument made that because the culmination of mean annual increment, which is sort of used as an index or has been used in the past as an index of biological maturity, occurs at age X, that's when we should stop managing stands and leave them alone. And I would argue as a silviculturist that there's a fundamental flaw in that logic, because the culmination of MAI is a variable point in time. It's not a fixed one. So it depends on site quality, it depends on initial stand densities, and it's also heavily influenced by disturbance history, including silvicultural activities like thinning. And activities like thinning effectively delay the culmination of MAI. So when we do any sort of partial canopy disturbance as silviculturists, one of the things we're doing is pushing back that timing of culmination. And some of the research that Bob Curtis has done in west side Doug fir forests suggests that just one or two thinnings can push back culmination of MAI to greater than 100 to 120 years, depending on site quality. So that's something to keep in mind as a defense against certain arguments. What else do we know about kind of how silviculture impacts stand development in the context of some of the objectives related to developing kind of late cereal and old growth characteristics? Well, we know a lot about management in younger stands under 80. We know that thinning, particularly heavily thinning, can accelerate the growth of residual trees, so you get bigger trees faster. It can delay crown recession, so you get deeper crowns, which could contribute in the long run to developing multi-layered canopies. It can promote understory development, maybe even enable the establishment of some shade-tolerant understory conifers, so start moving in the direction of a multi-age stand. But maybe on the downside, in the context of late cereal and old growth characteristics that we might be managing for, we know that thinning reduces deadwood inputs because we're effectively capturing mortality and reducing those deadwood inputs. But based on kind of these impacts that managing early stands may have, some people certainly argue that maybe we should concentrate our efforts on managing these younger stands, get them on a pathway towards developing a late cereal and old growth condition, and then just kind of walk away. And I'm going to make the argument that while that may certainly work in some situations, that might be a flawed approach in some other situations if what we're really trying to do is create and maintain a developmental pathway towards sort of complex late cereal and old growth structure. And I'll try to illustrate that with a case study and then back it up with some other research. So what you're looking at are some pictures from the crop tree treatment in the Black Rock thinning trial in the Coast Range. So this is on state forest land. And what this treatment basically was around age 48, this sort of dense stand of 500 or so trees per acre of primarily Douglas fir was cut down to 50 trees per acre. Well, actually 40 to 50 trees per acre, and then underplanted with hemlock. And for a number of decades, that stand was developing fantastic structure. The hemlock was doing great underneath. Those Doug fir in the overstory were growing into big size classes pretty rapidly, and it looked great. The problem is, you can have a pathway of development towards developing a lot of those characteristics we look for in old growth for decades, perhaps. But even at 40 to 50 trees per acre in the overstory cohort in this case, what's happened over time is those trees have grown, the crowns have expanded, and they've started to shade out that understory hemlock cohort. So we're starting to see dieback of that hemlock with, in the picture on the right, with kind of very limited understory development below the hemlock because we have quite high site occupancy. And what's effectively happening is we had a great pathway started by early treatment in this stand, but by kind of not continuing to manage the growing space allocation among those different cohorts that we're trying to promote, we've sort of deviated from that pathway. So the point I'd like to make is that in a lot of cases, if we're managing for multi-aged and kind of multi-storied structurally complex stands, it's probably going to require multiple entries rather than this sort of one-shot approach. And this isn't just my idea. I want to point that out. It's based on a lot of different people who are a lot smarter than me and have worked in this area for a lot longer than I have research. So quite a few people's research supports this idea that multiple entries may be needed in order to promote a long-term pathway towards kind of complex late cereal and old growth structure. Okay, so with that in mind, with some of these kind of broad concepts in mind, I want to talk a little bit about some of the approaches that are in our toolbox as silviculturists and where they might work and what objectives they might achieve and what objectives they might not achieve. And we'll start with no action. This is Cheryl's favorite slide. So the idea here is, no action is always kind of the beginning of a silviculturist toolbox. If we're going to achieve our objectives by doing nothing or do a better job of achieve our objectives than any of our active management alternatives, then ideally this is the objective this is the alternative we should go with. And where no action approaches probably make the most sense in the context of managing these over 80 stands to try and develop kind of late cereal and old growth characteristics is where those stands are already well on the pathway towards developing those characteristics, where we already see things like multi-aged and multi-storied canopies developing, where we already see large trees developing, where we already see some deadwood inputs starting to generate those characteristics. Where these approaches might not make as much sense is when we're working with these stands that are, maybe 80 or 100 or 120 years old, but are still quite dense, are still basically in a phase of self-thinning, so that the gaps that are being generated by tree mortality in those stands are pretty short-lived. And effectively, those short-lived gaps don't create opportunities for understory development, don't create great opportunities for new cohorts to develop and begin recruiting upward to generate a lot of the structural characteristics we're looking for. So if you were going to take a no-action approach and apply it to some of these dense, relatively structurally simplistic stands, you might eventually get to old growth condition. It's just going to take quite a bit longer to get there. Right? Okay, so how about commercial thinning on long rotation? So this is an approach that could theoretically be taken right now in matrix lands. And there are certainly some objectives it could achieve. Right? We can accelerate residual tree growth, so we get those large diameter trees faster. We can delay crown recession to an extent, which might promote the potential to start linking canopy layers and create those multi-layered canopies. As I said earlier, it's delay the culmination of mean annual increment, and we can address one of those other objectives associated with matrix lands that was brought up earlier, of producing some wood products and supporting local economies. On the downside, if we kind of stay within the range of residual overstory densities that are typically maintained in commercial thinning, we're probably going to have pretty slow understory development, so slow progress towards developing a truly multi-age stand, slow progress towards developing that range of tree sizes, and limited opportunities to regenerate shade-tolerant species. And because thinning effectively captures mortality, we'll have limited deadwood recruitment. And then we could also look at two-aged and uneven-aged approaches, so I'm kind of spanning together a lot of different silvicultural approaches in this particular slide. It could include everything from variable density thinning or regular shelter woods, and then true sort of uneven age group selection or individual tree selection approaches, which may or may not make sense depending on kind of the characteristics of the stands that we're working with. But where these approaches are maybe most likely to be successful in rapidly developing kind of old growth structural characteristics is where we can work with stands that already have some of the characteristics that we're looking for. Maybe some of those stands that had early thinning treatments to begin that developmental trajectory. We can start applying some of these two-aged and uneven-aged approaches to maintain that trajectory over time, rather than seeing sort of the tailing off that I kind of showed in my case study at Blackrock. On the downside, though, as has been brought up earlier, these are more complex approaches to implement, and tending multiple cohorts does take more frequent and repeated entries in all likelihood in order to kind of maintain that growing space allocation over time. Okay. And then we can look at even age regeneration in older stands, and I'd argue that some of these dense older stands that have limited complexity might be good candidates for regeneration harvests for a few reasons. One is that we'd have a limited loss of kind of current high quality late cereal and old growth habitat, because they're not really providing that on the landscape today. They're also not likely to develop into that condition in the near future without some kind of assistance, so we're not losing a likely future high quality late cereal and old growth habitat. And this provides an opportunity to maybe generate some of the early cereal habitat that seems to be lacking on the landscape today, right? Another reason we might think about regen cuts in older stands is that older stands provide opportunities to leave legacies that we really can't provide if we do kind of limited regen cuts to, say, 60 or 70 or 80-year-old stand. So some of these large diameter trees, large diameter deadwood legacies that can be very important in the context of providing lifeboating functions in early cereal environments. Those are the kinds of things that can really only be left if we're working with regeneration harvests starting with an older stand. And just as an example here, both of these are Northwest Forest Plan regen harvests on the Coquel tribe's land. So it is possible, recognizing that there are certainly some potential controversies associated with that kind of an approach. And then I'll wrap up and kind of hand it over to Stephanie pretty soon. Just by talking a little bit about deadwood considerations. So one thing we have to recognize as silviculturists if we're doing active management that involves any kind of harvesting, we're probably limiting or slowing the recruitment of deadwood into those stands. And that's certainly an important characteristic of Lake Cyril and old growth conditions. But on the other side, if we are managing stand densities in some way, we're potentially accelerating residual tree growth, so we're generating larger diameter green trees faster, which means we have an opportunity, if we take advantage of it silviculturally, to generate that sort of large diameter, longer lasting deadwood, potentially at earlier ages in stand development, rather than having to wait on those trees to grow in those size classes through a process of self-thinning. So from there, I'll turn it over to Stephanie to take some of these kind of broad idealistic concepts and impose a little bit of realism on them.
Thank you, Matt. So I'll keep it similarly general from the management standpoint. Matt's done an excellent job of providing an overview of the conceptual framework for over 80 stand management in silviculture. What I'll do is discuss how those concepts apply to the federal land management context, and then talk about the emerging trends in our federal land management plans, both historically and currently. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the trade-offs inherent in these decisions we make regarding the ecology, economics, and socio-ecological parts of the framework. So for context, I want to set the stage again generically. Federal lands cover about 640 million acres across the country, or about 28% of our land base. Those lands are managed primarily by 4 federal agencies, including Department of the Interior's BLM, National Park Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as USDA's Forest Service. So each agency follows a very complex set of laws, policies, and regulations, some shared, some distinct to each agency. Those include, you're not supposed to be able to read that. It's I think I use 10-point font for the screen, but suffice it to say that this is a short list of I didn't include them all. I'd like to highlight some of the key drivers of what we do on federal lands, including NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, FLPMA, or the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which is one I'm becoming to embrace as a new BLM employee, and also the National Forest Management Act as an old Forest Service employee. So while this federal land management scenario is bound by this complex set of laws, policies, and regulations, it's not a static framework. Rather, it's very dynamic and changing. Consistent with the concept of adaptive management, we're driven to incorporate new information, new science, and lessons learned based on past management. So again, it's an evolving framework. That's kind of a key thing I'd like to point out. Part of this evolving framework involves revising our land management plans. For BLM, it's RMP. For the Forest Service, it's LRMP. So different acronyms, same concept. It's what shapes what we do in our ground disturbing activities on federal lands. So evolving is a takeaway word from today. So for BLM, we're currently undergoing a plan revision for Western Oregon for the 2.5 million acres in the six districts. Our current land management plan is shaped by the 1994 Northwest Forest Plan, with the 1995 RMP management framework for Salem District specifically consistent with this plan direction from the Northwest Forest Plan. Like we talked about, this is not a static framework, but rather very dynamic. Here's a quote that I've always liked by Pipkin from '98. The Northwest Forest Plan was not intended to be a static creation, it was intended to evolve. And that kind of speaks to our ability to adapt and conform to new information and not keep our feet stuck in the mud in terms of our management approaches. So the current RMP revision that we've just put out in April would incorporate some of this new information that comes about through some of the monitoring plans. Some of the papers that you're seeing here are from people who were recently sitting here. Ray Davis is sitting right in front of me. I know he's had a hand in some of those bottom 3 there. So again, this new information will feed into the current RMP that we've recently released. So for Western Oregon BLM districts, the draft RMP or EIS will affect 6 districts. Purpose and need elements are very complex, some standard items there, but one of the key ones is the one in red font, if you can see the red font there, contributing to the conservation and recovery of TES species, and including maintaining a network of large blocks of forest, which speaks to the topic of today, over 80 years of age stands, and also maintaining older and more structurally complex multi-layered conifer forests. That element right there speaks to 2 different, somewhat distinct, not necessarily consistent elements: managing based on age, a strict age base, or versus based on structure. So big differences, and those things have big implications for what our options are managerially. So the draft RMP that we just released, it includes a no-action alternative, where's our, up on the right? Got it. Aha. Okay, so the draft RMP has, as NEPA directs, a no-action alternative, as well as 4 action alternatives, and then two sub-alternatives. So it's a complex NEPA document. It provides a full spectrum of management outcomes and options. What I'd like to point out here are a few key things. All action alternatives delineate reserve allocations as well as harvest land allocations, with the location and acreage of the allocations varying by alternative. Okay, that's one key point. I won't go into detail because Craig Kintop and Abe Wheeler will discuss those alternatives in detail later. I don't want to steal their thunder. In fact, Craig threatened me earlier. But for now, a key purpose and need element of the draft RMP is to maintain this large network of blocks of forest to be managed for late successional forest, and maintaining older and more structurally complex multi-layered conifer forests. The delineation of reserves is determined using a variety of metrics, some standardized, some more nuanced, including site-specific, site potential tree heights, standardized inner zone widths for riparian areas on fish-bearing and non-fish-bearing, perennial and intermittent streams. Also, habitat protection within known sites for marble murrelet. And the element I'd like to focus on today, since it's topical for our workshop, is the protection of structurally complex forest, with a selection based on several elements, including existing district-specific data, right there, and also stand age thresholds tiered to site productivity, with 120, 140, and 160 years of age for high, moderate, and low productivity sites, respectively. And finally, just stand age only. So we've got these categorical protective metrics that we're using. I've circled the 80 years of age for sub-alternative C, just to point to what we're talking about today as a group, to highlight that. So for alternatives A, C, sub-C, and D, stand age thus serves as a proxy for structural complexity. And as we know, as resource managers and academics, this is a pretty simplistic view. But again, in terms of NEPA, it provides a clear framework for what we're doing. So for our purposes today, only subalternative C would allow some more flexibility. All but subalternative C would allow for flexibility in managing over 80 years of age stands. So outcomes regarding the final decision on the EIS for Western Oregon have wide-ranging implications for management options. The ROD is going to define what options we have available in our silvicultural toolbox that we've been talking about. We've had a few folks talk about the toolbox concept, and it's pretty handy in this context. I've just highlighted here some of the 4 tools that we have proposed in the RMP. Again, Craig and Abel will speak to those in more detail. So the requisite snap-on toolbox, the large one on the left and the small one on the right, those indicate what kinds of range of options we'll have for our management, for managing successional pathways, not only in stands over 80 years of age, but younger and older. The selected alternatives toolbox will have profound implications again, and clearly the decisions on this new management framework that we'll be embracing will have significant ecological, economic, and social implications. For me, and I'm sure for all of us sitting in the room, is the key is selecting the appropriate management tool at the appropriate time in the appropriate place and managing the inherent trade-offs, including opportunities and constraints. And again, it goes back to our phrase of saying it depends where you're managing. So the final slide, I'll wrap up. I've got about 4 minutes here. Another takeaway that I have for you today is the concept of trade-offs. We're all familiar with that when we're doing our planning and our research. So regarding land management plans, there are a suite of trade-offs involved, including management opportunities and constraints, land use allocations, stand and landscape scale resiliency issues, structural and species diversity, tree vigor and stand productivity, coarsewood recruitment, wildlife habitat, and socioeconomic implications. And what I'd like to do here is just highlight a couple, given the time. I'll focus on management opportunities and constraints. Again, going back to the silvicultural toolbox concept. As a manager, I think we benefit from thinking about what tools are available within the respective land use allocations that we're managing in. When is deferred or no action alternative preferred, or when is a treatment approach preferred? That really goes to what the existing condition is relative to the desired future condition and how to bridge that gap based on our management or not management. The second component of that management opportunity and constraint topic would be the idea of single versus multiple entries and the NEPA process. I used to be in research. I know how research goes. It's good to think about modeling multiple entries to achieve very elegant silvicultural prescriptions. Now that I'm on the management side of the fence, I realize that it can sometimes be a more involved process than I knew before. The idea of a single entry hit a stand a little bit harder because we know we won't be able to get back in sometimes does come into play. Whereas in other areas, multiple entries are possible given the time, personnel, and budget, and also ecological situation. Sometimes that is appropriate, but finding that tipping point, that balance for the number of entries and how heavy to hit a stand to achieve your ecological objectives, that's something that we're really driven to do as managers. The second part and the final point I'll make here on the trade-offs concept is the idea of coarsewood. I want to go back to Matt's discussion about coarsewood and also speak to the wildlifers in the room. Lacking treatment, many stands would experience suppression mortality, and that involves small diameter mortality and pulses of small wood inputs to the forest floor. In contrast, opportunities for management allow a bit of coarsewood input over longer time periods, allowing larger coarsewood inputs over time. Consistent with some of the research by Tappener, Pogue, Tepley, Franklin, Freund, and others, the idea is nuanced management and management of stand densities can lead to more wolfy structures, deeper crown trees, more vigorous stands. It might not happen in our career timelines, but rather on different timelines, ecological timelines. The science is that we'll get larger trees faster through nuanced management than we might through no management in some cases. And so that's my plug for managing some areas. Again, we have multiple options for creating snags through our active management, through multiple methods, including targeted treatments such as girdling, fungal inoculation, blowing out tops, targeted prescribed fire by piling around the base of trees, and also contract specifications allowing operational mortality. As a whole, they allow pulses of coarsewood over time with different characteristics for wildlife that depend on coarsewood. So the main thing is on these trade-offs is the adaptive management concept. We need to continue this discussion. Thanks to Cheryl, we have these opportunities to get together and share information. continue the dialogue, keep learning from each other, and keep feeding the science that goes into our management plan revisions.